Hey everyone, we just finished our trip to Acadia National Park and we had a great time. In this video, we'll give you some of the highlights of the trip. Acadia National Park is located along the coast of Maine. The majority of the park is located on Mount Desert Island, however, there are also sections on the neighboring peninsula and on some of the surrounding islands. The park is actually scattered throughout Mount Desert Island. You can see the boundaries here. Most of the attractions are located on the eastern half of the island. The western half is less densely packed and is also known affectionately as the quiet side of the island, and that's where our first campground was located. We stayed in Seawall Campground, which is one of two in the park that allow RVs. The site was a little bit cramped, but there were enough trees that we didn't see our neighbors too often, and they also had free firewood, which meant that we got to make a fire pretty much every day there. We spent 5 days at the campground and we used it as our base for exploring Mount Desert Island. Right across the road from the campground was Seawall, which is what the campground is named for. And it's a natural seawall formed by these granite slabs and boulders, and it sort of forms this very distinct coastline that Acadia is known for. Seawall was a great introduction to this on our first night in the park, and it also had a really nice view of the sunset. Also nearby the campground was the Wonderland Trail. It's about a mile-long hike, but it's an easy trail that anyone could manage. At the end of the trail, you arrive at a rocky beach similar to Seawall, although this one is quite a bit bigger, and there's a lot to explore there. It's especially great at low tide since you can walk through the rocks and explore all the tide pools, and walk along the beach and see the shells and snails and all of that. I wouldn't really say it's a destination all by itself, and you can get a lot of similar scenery in other places in the park, but if you're nearby, it's a great place to stop and have a picnic, and that's exactly what we did. We also took a hike on the Flying Mountain Trail, which is a little peak located at the entrance to Somme Sound, the body of water that separates the eastern and western parts of the island. We had nice views of the sound from the top of the trail, and it also leads down to a beach along the sound. The beach was practically empty, and it was a really nice spot to walk along the water. Also, depending on when you're there, you can continue along the water on the Valley Cove Trail, which is supposed to be really great. But for us, it was closed since it's also where peregrine falcons are nesting in the cliffs. As you head to the eastern half of Mount Desert Island, you'll find a lot of the most notable attractions for Acadia. And the best way to introduce yourself to this section of the park is to drive the Park Loop Road. It runs around the perimeter of the park here, and there are many stops along the way. There's some really pretty overlooks, and there are plenty of places to get out and walk around and climb on the rocks or sit on the beach. One of the first stops on the loop are the Wild Gardens of Acadia and the Sieur de Monts Nature Center. The gardens have over 300 different plants, all labeled and broken up into their different ecosystems, and you can wander the paths and get acquainted with all the plants you're going to be seeing throughout the rest of your time in the park. Our next stop was at Sand Beach. This is a really popular stop, at least if you're there on a hot day, since it's one of the few places where you can swim in the park. We were there for the hiking though, and right across the beach is the start of the Great Head Trail. It loops around a peninsula along the coast, and there are great views looking back at the beach and looking out at the water. It was a bit challenging though since it's very rocky. After Great Head, we continued on to Gorham Mountain. It's one of the lower peaks on the island, but it's still a really nice hike, and since it's right along the coast, there are great views of the water, and you can also see Cadillac Mountain behind you. When you continue down the mountain, you can loop around and then follow the ocean path back to Sand Beach, and it makes a great loop for a day hike. If you're more adventurous than we are, you could also do the Beehive hike, which is in this area and is very popular. The Park Loop Road will also take you on to Jordan Pond and Cadillac Mountain, but we save those stops for another day. This side of the island is also home to Bar Harbor, and it's definitely worth a stop on your trip. has a really pretty waterfront, and at low tide you can walk across a sandbar to the neighboring Bar Island. We didn't really plan it, but we got lucky and arrived near low tide, so we were able to walk out on the sandbar and get a great view back at the town. We also stopped at Atlantic Brewing Company to try some local beer and have a little bit of food. One of the biggest attractions in the park is Cadillac Mountain. It's the highest peak, and it's also known for being the first place in the US to see the sun each morning. Got pretty early to get there and beat the crowds, but we packed our camp stove and we made some oatmeal and coffee and had breakfast while we waited. We had to arrive about an hour early to actually get a parking spot anywhere near the peak. We did have a few clouds blocking the sun, but otherwise it was a really clear morning, and I'm really glad we went and did it. We ended up going back up Cadillac Mountain to watch sunset another day, and it was really beautiful, and I'd highly recommend this as well. The spot we picked to watch also had some wild blueberries, so we were able to pick those while we waited. Another big attraction in the park are the carriage roads. These are a system of over 50 miles of packed gravel paths built by John D. Rockefeller in the early 1900s. No motor traffic is allowed, so they're great for bikes, hiking, and horse carriage rides if you'd like to do that. There are also many bridges built for the roads to cross various streams and valleys, and they're really neat to see. Some of the sections of the trail are pretty steep though, so make sure you check the elevation before you go out on the paths. But whichever ones you end up taking, they all have really beautiful views, and I highly recommend checking them out when you're at the park. My favorite hike of the trip was to South Bubble Mountain. It was a relatively easy hike up the north side of the mountain, not too rocky and not too many big steps. At the top, there were really great views of North Bubble Mountain and Sargent Mountain to the north, and you had amazing views of Jordan Pond to the south. This is also the location of Bubble Rock, which is a famous glacial erratic that was dropped at the top of the mountain by a glacier during the last ice age. And we had some fun with it, taking pictures before we headed down the mountain. After enjoying the views, we headed down the south slope of the mountain. A ranger had warned us that the north slopes of the mountains tended to be easier, and the south slopes tended to be more challenging, and they were definitely right. This was the hardest trail we did on the entire trip, but we did make it down, and we were glad we did it at the end. After South Bubble Mountain, we hiked the Jordan Pond Trail Loop, which is a path that runs the whole way around Jordan Pond, and had really great views of both the pond and the mountains that we had just climbed. Along the way, we stopped at the Jordan Pond House and had a popover and some dinner. For the last few days of the trip, we left Seawall Campground at Mount Desert Island and headed to the Scudic Peninsula. The only reason we actually went there was that I found a ton of great reviews for the campground and I really wanted to check it out, and it did not disappoint. The campground was quiet and you had tons of space and privacy. Since we had all the space, it was really easy to take the kitties out and let them walk and explore, and we even managed to get Ollie walking on his leash a little bit. The park was close to Fraser Point, which had a nice little park, so we explored that a bit on our first day there. It's a great place to put in a kayak or a boat if you have one and explore the harbor, or just walk along the beach and play with rocks. The next day, we took our bikes out to ride around the park loop on the peninsula. There were some really nice stops along the way, including the Scudic Institute, which supports research and education in the park. The highlight of the loop was definitely Scudic Point, which was at the very tip of the peninsula and had amazing views of Mount Desert Island and Cadillac Mountain. It was a little cloudy while we were there, so we couldn't get a great view, but if we had more time and better weather, it would have been a great spot to watch the sunrise as the light first hits the mountain. All in all, we really loved Acadia. The scenery was beautiful and there were great hiking trails and bike paths everywhere. We were there in mid-July, so it was pretty busy in some of the spots, but there were still plenty of places to explore where we felt like we were the only people there. If you haven't been, I really recommend going to Acadia. I know that we definitely hope to get back someday.